Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm your host, David Geiger. Today on Farm Here Daily, we continue to watch harvest progress and Armyworm. Extension agronomist Angie Rieck-Hinz has an update from northern Iowa. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Here Daily. And joining me on Farm Here Daily, we're going to take a look at northern Iowa crops. Harvest is starting to roll out across the state, and with us is Angie Rieck-Hinz, ISU Extension agronomist in the northern part of the state. Angie, thanks so much for joining us again on Farm Here Daily. And let's start off with the start of harvest season. What has been your first impression so far, and what's going on in your part of the state?
We've been at harvest nearly 2 solid weeks already in north central Iowa, right? It's very spotty as to what's coming out. In fact, there's some significant corn acres out in places, but I just saw my first field of beans cut on Wednesday. I'm sure there's more than that, right? I just happened to drive by and there were some beans out. I'm sure we've slowed it down just a little bit in the last day or two because we've had some rain, but it's been really scattered rain, so not everybody's out of the field. That's for sure. But you asked me what my impressions were. My impressions are, right, we had a good chunk of our corn crop mature faster than usual because of warmer than usual weather and stresses and southern rust. And that's one thought that's on my mind. And then obviously we got to about mid-August and we started seeing a lot of disease pressure in some soybeans. So the soybeans, for the most part, still are turning, right? Still have a lot of green tissue in some places. And so we've started taking corn out first.
Right. And those soybeans staying a little bit of green, a little bit, not super far behind normal schedule, but it is a little bit behind. And how is that changing up farmers' decisions? Because I would have guessed they would have been trying to pull out as much corn with standability issues as they could right about now as well.
I agree. I think that's why we started with corn. Besides, I mean, we planted corn fairly early and we planted beans early too, but that corn standability is a really big challenge right now. I had an opportunity to look at some hybrid trials yesterday, and I think in about every third plot, we were pinching stalks that were already just really super soft, right? And you really didn't want to lean up against those stalks because they were just going to snap right off. So I think standability is an important discussion. I know there's some down corn over by Otho from the wind and storms that came through on Tuesday. So I think people maybe want to pause for a little bit, reevaluate how to prioritize some of those fields. If we get a big wind or we continue to get these thunderstorms that are coming through with maybe some downbursts here and there, I think our corn crop is just not in the best of shape for standability.
So we did mention that the soybeans are still a little bit green. Is there any last chance of some of these rains that we've had over the last week or so impacting them just a little bit more, or is that pretty much said and done?
No, our beans are our beans are done, right? We're just trying to get to the point where things have turned color. I mean, most of the leaves are brown or yellow or they're dropping leaves, but there's still some greenish looking stems out there. And so it's just going to take a little bit of time to get those dried down to get through them. Let's hope it's not like last year where we went from like 15% moisture beans down to 9% like overnight, or so it seemed. But I assume some people are going to switch from corn and go back to beans as the beans are a little bit more mature, finished off, dry down just a little bit here in the next week or so. I think the people that started on corn, for the most part, a lot of those folks, they may continue with corn, but it's really going to depend on where that corn standability is. And there are some bean fields ready, but there's just not a whole lot of beans that look like they're totally ready to go yet.
Moving back into the corn side of things, I've heard some notes from folks on the farm that there are pretty decent moisture levels so far from the early stuff. Is that what you're seeing in northern Iowa? Because I know there was worry that with all the rain and all the moisture we've had over the year, that we would be facing a little bit on the wetter side of corn.
Are you talking in terms of soil moisture or plant moisture?
Plant moisture,
Plain moisture, right? So, yeah, so I think the reports I have, right? Some people started really early that corn was above right at 22 or a little bit more percent moisture, right? So, we're slowly dropping that down. This last week, a lot of people were running at about 18 to 19%. I had one guy tell me he's down to 14%. But it's still like up there just a little bit, right? If we get some sun, dry things out just a tad bit more. We haven't had, there are places that had a lot of rain this week, so things might not slow down or dry down quite as fast, but just because of the humidity. But I think in a lot of places we're finally running around about 19% or at least below 20%. So I think that we're doing okay on moisture. Nobody really wants to pay to dry grain this year, so some people are going to let it stand as long as possible, and some people are going to wish they would have combined it while it was still standing. We run into that every year.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you asked the clarifying question of soil moisture, plant moisture before, because that is a question I wanted to follow up with a little bit, because over, extremely wet June and then less but wetter July and not wet August and not wet September, how has that soil moisture composition changed in terms of the farm equipment that's now in the fields? Are there any worries about that, or is it perfect conditions out there?
It is not perfect conditions in some places, right? Thankfully we dried out a little bit since July, and we shouldn't have to worry about trafficability in a lot of places. But I pulled up the rainfall report for June and July just to remind ourselves what June and July were, right? Like Fort Dodge had over 17 inches of rain, which is almost 7.75 inches of rain above average for
It's
June
a
and July.
lot.
It's a lot. And then you look at like Northwood, almost 21 inches of rain for June and July, which is 11.5 inches above average. I will admit, 6 weeks ago, not quite 6 weeks ago, maybe 5 weeks ago, I was really concerned about where we were going to be in getting into the field and what it was going to look like trying to harvest, right? Because it seemed to still be pretty wet in there in some places, but we've kind of dried out that topsoil a little bit. But as soon as I say that, somebody from that Fort Dodge area is going to listen, and they had 3 to 5 inches of rain in places the other night, so they're out of the field for a little while. So I'm always very leery about how to talk about conditions when you cover such a big geographic space. It's going to certainly be different from one area to the next. So we have thankfully gotten past that June and July standing water point, at least.
This is Farm Your Daily. We will have more conversations on the way, but first, let's take a look at the marketplace. And there was a mostly negative trade at the close for Friday. December corn was up a quarter penny, 4.24, but March was down a quarter penny, 4.41 and a quarter. Soybeans in November, though, 12 cents a bushel in the red, $10.25 and a half cents. January, a decrease of 11 3/4 at 10.44 3/4. Soybean meal in October, 10 cents a ton, lower at $282.90. Soybean oil in October, half a penny weaker at 50.03 a pound. December wheat, a penny and 3/4 down, 5.22 and a half, with March a decrease of a penny and 3/4 at 5.40 3/4. Hard red winter wheat, 2 3/4 cents down, 5.07 and a quarter, with March falling 2.5 cents, 5.29 and a quarter. Looking into the livestock market close for Friday. October live cattle ended the day $1.20 a hundredweight in the green at $233.57. December up $1.57 at $235.72. Feeder cattle in October $2.37 a hundredweight more, $354.10. November rising $3.70 at $350.92. Lean hogs in October, half a dollar more at $97.97, with December falling 7 cents at $87.62 a hundredweight. That is the Friday market close. This is Farm Your Daily. Angie, I'm going to move us along to a different topic that some producers are facing over there in northern Iowa, and that is some rumors around the state that I've heard of armyworms, specifically in the not necessarily crop fields, but some of the smaller grains fields or maybe hay fields, etc. What are you seeing? What are your recommendations? What are folks talking about?
Yeah, this issue is not just limited to northern Iowa, but um, sort of like last fall, right? A couple of falls ago, you'll remember the fall armyworm outbreak was pretty serious to the point they were even eating people's lawns. People were kind of worried about that. We do have fall armyworms in northern Iowa, right? I haven't found any down here. Like I live in central Iowa, but I haven't seen any in fields here. But certainly some of those small grains that have already been planted or cover crops that have been planted, right? That were flown on. Maybe that corn's out and they're just coming up. Or whatever the case is, there's some small grains that tend to go in after oats just to serve as a cover crop, or maybe they're going to graze them yet this fall. Some of those fields are being decimated very quickly, right? The fall armyworm numbers on the ground, larvae are outstanding. The ground is moving in some cases, right? We would say, I think if you had 3 to 4 larvae per square foot, that's an issue, right? And you may want to think about treating. I think people are having a hard time deciding if they want to treat, given the way crop prices are, at least input costs are at this point in time. But I would be scouting those alfalfa fields for sure, especially if you think you're going to get another cutting this fall. And then there are some people that have those small grains for grazing yet this fall that have lost some acreage because of that armyworm feeding. So my experience on Monday of this week was the armyworms in those fields were anywhere from 2 inches long, which means they're about done eating and doing their thing, to about a ½ inch long, right? So there's a wide variety in sizes. So they are going to continue to feed until they get pretty big. And so there's a lot of stuff that's still susceptible to being eaten out there.
As there is stuff that is susceptible to being eaten, you were saying folks are going to have to weigh whether to treat it or not. What are some challenges later on that could come from not treating them, as aside from obviously some of the vegetation they're still eating?
Well, I think the big issue is what were you planning to do with some of those late summer seeded cereals? If you were planning to graze those to extend your grazing season this fall, and all of a sudden all your green cow chow is gone, right? That might be an issue. So that might be why we consider treating. A couple of things to think about if you decide to treat, right? We would say pyrethroids are likely a good option, but we need to make sure we read those insecticide labels simply from a standpoint of they're going to have a pre-harvest interval or an interval between when that product's applied and when it can be grazed. So please make sure you read the labels before you do any applications, just to make sure you're staying on label there. I think for most people, if they seeded something to be a fall cover crop, they probably don't care so much if that's disappeared. But if they were going to plan to graze it or maybe even chop it quick this fall, because we've had a fairly warm fall and we're getting some decent growth on these things, they might be out a food supply, right, that they were counting on for this fall.
When we talk about this as well, I think when you say small grains, I think a lot of some of the cover crops that are out there. Is that primarily the potential cause of problem here, is in terms of having your cover crops damaged or fall cover crops damaged, or are you talking about some of the farmers who have some more of those small grains just as a value added agriculture aspect of their operation?
Right. I mean, it could be the cover crop situation, right? Obviously, when I'm sometimes scouting fields, I don't know if, in some cases, if they've come back in after an oats field or they had some early corn taken out and they've seeded a cover crop, if they were hoping to go back in and graze that or not, right? In either case, it could be that way. Um, it's hard for me to know that as I'm out there scouting, because I honestly don't know where I am some days. I don't know whose field I'm in. I always know where I am, but I don't always know whose
Right.
field I'm in or what exactly they're doing if I pop in and out of a field. Obviously, if we think we can get another cutting of alfalfa this fall, I think people will want to scout that alfalfa for sure. Our row crops, our corn and our soybeans are way too mature. They're dried down. They're not attractive to fall armyworms at all. And then you can think about your lawn, right? A couple of years ago, I think maybe that was 2020 or 2019, we had fall armyworm outbreak where people were missing good chunks of their lawn and couldn't understand what had happened overnight. So I'm not a turf grass expert by any means, but if these things are hungry, they're always gonna go for green, living, fairly immature material, right? That's what they're looking for, the green, juicy stuff. That's the best way to say that.
Angie, as just a wrap up question here, I want to just take a look at the next couple of weeks. What are you really watching for out there in the fields? What are potential calls you're expecting from farmers, or what would you like them to know?
Well, I think a couple of things I just want to point out based on some phone calls of this last week. I had a phone call from a county emergency management emergency management director. We've had some field fires already, so just want to remind people to be super cautious, careful. Right, this corn crop dried down a lot faster than expected. There's a lot of dead leaf tissue that had a lot of rust on it. Right, so the rust spores, the once that crop dies down, those rust spores usually turn from orange to black. They're not going to infect that plant, but we still have a lot of dust in the air, right? And a lot of dirty, so to speak, plants. And once the tissue dies, we get saprophytic fungi. So we can get a lot of dusty, moldy stuff in the air. Generally speaking, those are not human health concerns, but if you have respiratory issues, you may want to think about wearing your N95 mask while you're in the combine. I would encourage you to keep your combine filters cleaned frequently, keep things greased and lubed well, just because we've already seen some fires and it seemed kind of early for that this year. So just be cautious and be aware of your surroundings when these things happen. A couple of other things, I think questions I had this, most of the questions I get this time of year are people are starting to think about their fall fertilizer plans. So I've been doing a lot of one-on-one consults with people about fertilizer plans. Fertilizer is generally much more expensive this fall than it has been. As we all know, inputs are a little higher. We also know crop prices are a little lower. So people are trying to decide where to allocate those fertilizer dollars. So that's a great conversation to have with not only your retailer, but maybe your extension agronomist. So I tend to spend a little time doing some one-on-ones with folks. And interestingly enough, a lot of that conversation happens while they're in the combine thinking about things. And that's all good. So I enjoy that.
Well, we appreciate having you talking about all those important aspects of the harvest and all your great analysis so far here on Farm Here Daily. Really appreciate your time. Angie Rieck-Hinz is a Northern Iowa extension agronomist with ISU, and we are so glad to have you here, and hopefully you have a good rest of the harvest season. I know you're going to be busy out there talking to folks and seeing what's going on, or maybe it might be a little bit less busy because you won't have as many farmers calling you. They'll be busy at harvest. But either way, we're really glad to have you here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
This is Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you again so much for listening. In order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again on Monday. Have a good weekend, everybody.